Well, good morning, folks. In our text in 2 Corinthians, it's important, I think, that we begin by thinking about to whom this was written. The Apostle Paul was the man that started the church of Christ in Corinth. Now, Paul preached the gospel, and that's the way the church was established. Paul is not the founder of the church. He is one of the apostles that preached the message. The power is not in Paul. The power is in the gospel. We need to always remember that. The preaching of the gospel or the teaching of the gospel is that which produces followers of Christ. Sometimes we say a man converted somebody else to Christianity. Well, the only way a man can do that is to preach the gospel. He can't convert people to Christianity with his good looks. He can't produce Christians by being a great speaker. It might add to the preaching of the gospel, but it's the gospel that changes people. I wish I had the power to change people. I don't. And you know, it's probably a good thing. I might not change them into what they need to be. The gospel message is what changes people. Now, Paul started the church in Corinth. And sometimes we think we don't want to preach the gospel to somebody because they're not interested and they're vulgar people, or maybe they're all in prison and all of that, you know. We'll skip them. Well, if you had to pick a city in the ancient world where you wouldn't go to preach the gospel, it'd be Corinth. It was Sin City. Every kind of practice immorality known to man was practiced in Corinth. Every kind of person in the Western world lived in Corinth. You know, it wasn't difficult to find a place of immorality because they literally had street signs saying, "This is the street." But Paul went there and he preached. And you know, who did he preach to? Some men and women that were just practicers of immorality, but the gospel touched their hearts when they heard about a God that was not a physical God, when they heard that he sent his Son to this earth, and when they heard that he was crucified by the Romans at the instigation of the Jews. And here was the punchline. The third day, Christ arose from the dead. Corinthians knew about dying. Listen, every civilization does. And many times the idea of dying was just simply unacceptable. But they knew it was real. But here came this preacher preaching that the Son of God came to this earth and he died and he rose from the dead 3 days later and later ascended into heaven to be with the Father again. They became Christians. But they had terrible backgrounds. They did not know about the events described in the Old Testament because most of them were Gentiles. And so when you start reading the 6th chapter of 2 Corinthians, Paul says all kinds of things. He said some of you were thieves, some of you were liars, some of you were engaging in immorality, sexually and otherwise. He said, but you've been washed. You've been forgiven when they were baptized into Christ. This is the 3rd letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. We've got the 1st letter, and then in this letter, Paul says, this is the 3rd time I've written to you. We do not have the 2nd letter. This is the 3rd one. And they're still dealing with the same problems they had earlier. As Paul wrote in the 2nd letter that we have, the Apostle Paul mentions the fact that some of the men in the congregation are still going up to the houses of prostitution, fornication. And he uses these words, flee fornication. Stop it. They'd been part of their old life. And then in our passage this morning, he explains that to sit at the Lord's table, like the figuratively one that we have behind me to represent the Lord's Supper. He said when you eat the Lord's Supper, you can't eat to those things that are dedicated to idols. In other words, they were still trying to continue in their old practices that were immoral, violated the teachings of Christ, and still be a Christian. You know anybody still trying to do that today? I'm afraid a whole lot of us are at times. We're trying to be good, but yet let's try bad. And they, like people today, make justifications. Well, yeah, I did that, but I know a brother at church that does worse things than I do. That's the weakest excuse developed by man. There's always somebody that's worse off than you, right? If you don't believe me, you ought to be a principal in school and have these students brought to your office. Yes, but Mr. Morgan, I didn't do as bad as Joey did out here. Yeah, probably so. But anyway, it's important that we not necessarily go through the words of this passage, but look at what it is saying. It is saying that we as Christians, and certainly it's true, can be influenced by others. I think of children once in a while in terms of this idea. You know, daddy or mother perhaps has a certain phrase that they use over and over again. You know, we all do, but don't recognize it. And then here we have a little boy or a little girl, and they're barely old enough to speak, and all of a sudden we hear them utter the same phrases. That's influence. And you know, I also notice that sometimes out of the mouths of these little children come very sophisticated phrases. Where did they hear it? They heard it from Mama. They heard it from Daddy. We can be influenced as adults. And it happens every day. Influenced as adults. And sometimes it's being influenced for good. And then sadly, other times it can be an influence that leads us to practice some kind of evil. We can be influenced to support things financially and otherwise. But what this passage is saying to us, we've got to be careful about who we associate with. We've got to be careful about whom we support with our opinions, with our money. Christian, you've got to be different than the world. That's the whole idea. Now, we're not trying to be different. By the way, you can be different in a lot of ways. You know, I could come this morning to this building to speak to you. I could be wearing my swimming trunks. Now, that would be embarrassing to me and mortify you. I could, couldn't I? How'd I look with pink hair? Don't look at me, Kendra. I can be influenced. And we've got to be careful. It's not the idea that just we got to be different. I can be different by wearing those swimming trunks or pink hair or something this morning. I'd be different. But the thing that we need to remember is this. As a Christian, we avoid evil. We support good. And that automatically makes us different. I heard a man say, and I was there, speaking to a woman, and he'd had some relationship with her in the sense that it was business relationship. And they were talking about that business relationship. And after they concluded an agreement between the two of them, he said, "Ma'am, you're the finest woman I've ever known. You're honest. You care about me. And you treat me better than I deserve." Hey, there can't be a better compliment to someone than that, is there? He was acknowledging that that particular business partner was different than most people, right? She was different. So as Christians, we're different because of our relationship and our obedience to Christ. And believe you me, that makes a difference. 1 month ago today, in Hobbs, New Mexico, something happened that morning that I want to begin with. January the 7th, 2022. Just a month ago today. 3 individuals in Hobbs, New Mexico, 1 man, 2 women, were out dumpster diving. I don't know if we have any dumpster diving folks in here or not. Maybe 1. One of the men was a homeless man, and they go around to the dumpsters to find something they can eat or something they can retrieve that they could sell for something. And as they raised the lid on this one dumpster, they started moving around some of the trash, one of the men inside, and they thought they heard something. So they started digging a little deeper and found a plastic bag, trash bag, 2 of them, and they thought they heard a baby crying in that bag. So they dug it out, and sure enough, there was a baby there. Still had the umbilical cord fastened to it. They called 911, and the 911 lady, whatever that position's called, questioned them and said, "Is it alive?" And they said, "Yes, it is." And finally the police arrived, and they took the baby to the local hospital. It was later determined that the baby was 6 hours old. 6 hours. And they life-flighted the baby to Lubbock, Texas, to a trauma hospital there. And it reached the news media. It was on television there, on television in Dallas, on television in Hobbs, on the radio, talk shows. Tremendous amount of sympathy for that baby boy. What the mother of that baby did not know was that there was a camera somewhat distance from the dumpsters. And as her car drove up, she went out and opened the lid to the dumpster and threw the baby into the dumpster and closed the lid. Within a few hours, she was arrested, charged with attempted murder and several other charges. And there were people that called into the talk shows and said they ought to execute her today, or she needs to spend the rest of her life in prison. How can a mother have a baby and threw it in the garbage? She's 18 years old. The tremendous amount of outpouring for that little baby. And you can look it up and read all of the details. The father of the baby, a 16-year-old boy, his family is now trying to get custody of the baby on the basis that it's their grandson. But there's something that comes to my mind, and I want to share it with you. All of that wonderful outpouring. By the way, they're raising money to get that homeless man a house. The police are praised. The 911 lady is receiving her share of praise. But let's go back a week before this. If that mother had decided she didn't want that baby, she could go down to the abortion clinic and have it aborted. There would not have been one single line in print anywhere or on any television or radio program. There would have been absolutely nothing. Does that not sound hypocritical? But according to the laws of this land, that would have been a very legitimate right that that mother had to have that baby aborted. She made a mistake. She should have had it aborted, and there would be no charge against her today. Am I not right? But yet, now she is a terrible, terrible young woman. Folks, there have been cases in this country where a pregnant woman was murdered. And then the individual that caused the murder is charged with first-degree murder and the first-degree murder of the unborn infant. What about that young mother in Hobbs, New Mexico? Is she ever going to forget that day? That little boy has since been named. I don't know where he will end up. They named him Saul, S-A-U-L. And someday, somebody will say, do you recall? No, he doesn't. What happened? But they'll be glad to tell him. What's that going to do to that little boy? But yet we have people who call themselves Christians who condone it. You see why it's so important? When the Supreme Court addressed this issue way back in the 70s, public opinion was probably 60% against it. Today, it's 60-some% for it. You see what Paul's talking about? We've got to be careful about whom we associate. We've got to be careful about whom we support. And how we support it with our finances. Come out from among them and be different. And there's a lot more of the same thing that we could describe this morning, but I want to look at one more. I want to go back to the 6th chapter. Well, not the 6th chapter. Well, I'll get it here in a minute. The 4th chapter. Well, you know, sometimes things slip me, and I'm sliding right now. Anyway, the Apostle Paul describing those that I'm bound and determined I'm going to find it here. You know why I can't find it? It's in the 6th chapter, but it's 1 Corinthians. I can look all day long in 2 Corinthians. Look in verse 9 of the 6th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Know you not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Now, who are the unrighteous that he's talking about? Know you not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived. Neither fornicators, fornicators, sexual immorality, includes all kinds of things. Idolaters, idol worshipers. Oh, we don't have that in America. Listen, folks, you can travel to the big cities in America and you can find these great big religious buildings dedicated to idols. Idolaters, effeminate, homosexuals, thieves, covetous, drunkards, revelers. I like another translation there, a little more closer to home. Party goers. In other words, all I want to do is party all the time. Extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God. And such were some of you. Look at that list. In that list, we could talk about covetousness, thievery, drunkards, revelers. We could talk about all kinds of immorality, including homosexuality. One of the things that the Bible is as clear on as daylight from darkness is that the practice of homosexuality is against every principle God has laid down. Under the Jewish law, if individuals were caught practicing homosexuality, they were executed immediately. The outlook in the New Testament, our God looks at it this way. It's sin, and it needs to be repented of and asked for forgiveness. The church at Corinth had ex-thieves in it. They had ex-extortioners. They had ex-fornicators. They had ex-homosexuals. But they changed. We're going to ask you to turn to what hymn?
578.
578. Trust and obey. We're going to offer the invitation of Christ. And if you need to respond, do so now while we stand and sing, please.